Hola, bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Heriberto Gonzalez. I'm one of the members and one of the hosts of HoMoVISIONES, a public access show created in 1994 by Cándido Negrón, Gonzalo Burto, Gamaliel de Jesús, Héctor Seda, and others who were members at the time of the ACT UP Latino caucus. I want to thank Rosa Cruz from the Center of Puerto Rican Studies, Kimberly, also for inviting me to host this library lunch hour to have a brief conversation on queer identity in media. The moderator for this event will be James King, and Mr. King is the current artistic director of All Arts. Most recently, he was the managing director, of Harlem Stage. He also served in various administrative and leadership positions with arts organizations such as the Public Theater, the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, and Sherry Lane Theater. He is a member of the Off-Broadway Leagues of Theaters and producer, the board of director of the New Yorkers for Culture, and a voter and nominator for the Lucille Lortel Awards. Keynes also served as a consultant to and on peer review panels, such as organizational as the National Education Association, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and the Susan Smith Blackburn Awards. I'm gonna leave you now with Mr. James. Hello.
Thank you, Heriberto. So it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon with everyone, hosting this discussion on queer identity in media. It's something that I am very passionate about, and I'm excited to share with you the work that I was able to do with Jorge Merced, and we'll also be talking to Aida Garrido, who is an archivist who archived the HoMoVISIONES collection. But before we get started, I'd like to share their bios with you, and then we're going to see a clip from the film that Jorge created for All Arts. So Jorge Merced is the Associate Artistic Director of Pregones Puerto Rican Theater. Jorge is an award-winning theater director, actor, cultural activist, and mentor with a strong passion for Latina communities and LGBTQIA plus free expression. His manner of work draws from the principles of multidisciplinary collective creation, community self-determination, and a lifelong learning in the arts. His decades-long leadership has been central to the company's interborough New York City season, playing a decisive role in empowering underserved artists and audiences to claim their rightful place at the front of American theater. Welcome, Jorge. And Aida Garrido, archivist of the HoMoVISIONES collection. Aida is a sound and moving image archivist interested in preserving all forms of cultural heritage. She has worked with the David Zwirner Gallery, Blank Forms, iFilm Museum, the Rietveld Academy, Brooklyn Museum, and CUNY TV. She received her BA in history from Princeton University and her MA in film preservation from the University of Amsterdam. So before we get started with the conversation, I thought we'd take a look at a clip from Jorge's film, which is called Jorge, you got to forgive me. We'll come back to the title of the film. Let's show the clip.
The name Asuncion comes from a song that I used to listen to when I was a child that went Asuncion, Asuncion, ese hijo va a ser marinero, meaning Asuncion, your son is going to be queer. The townspeople talking about the way that he walks, that's a bad sign. And for a young queer kid growing up, listening to that in the radio and people laughing about it, it leaves an impact on you. What about that son, the sons of Asuncion? How would they feel? And about that mother, because they never asked her how she felt. And I felt, well, we're going to do a project called Los Hijos de Asuncion, the children of Asuncion. And that's where Asuncion comes from, just to take back that which was meant to hurt us and to turn it into a badge of honor so that we can come back to our community stronger and say, let's talk about this.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Jorge, let's repeat the name of your film, Queer Latine Voices at Teatro Pregones. So I wanted to share with everyone that I approached you about creating this film approximately a year ago. And when I first spoke with you about the film, I told you about the initiative we were doing at All Arts, which was called The First 20. And I shared with you the central idea that artists would share with viewers a seminal moment in the first 20 years of the 21st century and how that changed American culture. Can you share with the viewers why you chose the Latina LGBTQ community in particular versus the queer community in general?
Thank you, James, and it's a pleasure to be sharing this stage, particularly now that we're celebrating Pride Month here in New York City, and to talk about these moments in our history that I believe are so important to recapture. I think as a theater artist, I came of age in the late 20th century, and I've always drawn inspiration from struggles for liberation, particularly within the realm of the Latina LGBTQIA lives. And as such, I believe that the first 2 decades of this century really pointed to a major shift in the paradigm of consciousness in the United States and also in the world. You know that silence is no longer our mandate, but there's still a long road ahead of us. And I know we've seen our stories and our voices lifted in media more than before, but one thing that led me to choose this particular topic was that I believe that the gradual shifts that you find within communities of color regarding LGBTQIA plus themes often precede those larger shifts in the population, and they're really rarely documented as such. So for me, it was important that this film aimed to formally document one of those moments of exploration, dialogue, celebration by and primarily for LGBTQIA plus artists and audiences in the heart of the boogie down South Bronx. So for me, reclaiming this history with this film and using the tools of my craft, which is theater, and asking questions about identities that I hold most dear is as much an act of affirmation as it is an act of liberation. And I feel like it's important that we really take those tools on our hands and document our history and share that and celebrate that with our community. So I felt like the first 20 really pointed me to that direction of saying, why is it important right now that we talk about these moments in our history that were created by our community, for our community, and share it with the world as saying, this is our history and this is why uh, our communities of color really are always at the forefront of how we understand those shifts in consciousness.
Right. So Jorge, you use community in two ways there. You talked about the LGBTQ plus community, and then you talked about the boogie down South Bronx community. So what I'd like to have you share with the viewers is how did you hope the project Asuncion would be received by the boogie down Bronx community, and what efforts did you make to engage them in a way that was not alienating?
Sure, that's a great question, James. I mean, the Bronx has been my home for so many years, and where I go to create, where I exchange ideas that are new and on the forefront of my field of theater. I often say that the best theater I see, it's actually artists that are working in the Bronx. So for me, it was the most natural step. If I want to talk about how our community is understanding LGBTQIA plus issues, where else but the Bronx? Because that's where I find the most inspiration, and also that notion that people often think like, oh, the Bronx is this place that is a bit behind in terms of understanding or willingness to talk about issues that are perceived by society as being challenging. And I always say that is not my experience of the Bronx, particularly the South Bronx. I mean, throughout the entire AIDS epidemic back in the 80s and 90s, you see people out there having those conversations about how are we getting access to health, how are we getting access to information. You will see queer people in the mornings. I remember walking out and you will see, queer families going to school, taking their kids to school and being part of the community. So we do not shy away from those conversations in the Bronx. So I think it was more about the outside of the Bronx perceiving the Bronx as a place where these types of places wouldn't happen. For us, it was completely normal, natural. This is what we do in the Bronx. We talk about things together. We figure things out together. We learn together. We make mistakes together. So I didn't see any other place but the Bronx to have a project like Asuncion flourish, and it was received beautifully by the community. I only thought it was going to be like a 1 year event festival, and it ended up being 10 years because people kept on asking for more, and it was an honor to open up that space, but then to just listen and learn with everybody as to what defines us, what defines the LGBTQI plus community in the
Right.
Bronx.
So, one of the things that we saw in the clip that was just shared was that the idea came to you from the title of a song. And the implication in that clip was that that song was something that was popular, that was heard on the radio. I'm assuming it was the radio back in the day, not streaming. So, can you talk about the decision to name the festival Asuncion and what that meant for you personally, and how you thought other people would take that, knowing the popularity of the song itself?
Sure, sure. I think the impact that popular or the industry of music and mainstream media has in our communities is one that has been examined and talked about very often. But on a personal level, it does leave that impact on you. And I remember growing up, as I said in the clip, as a child, listening to people laughing at this song and singing it in the chorus, and people winking at each other like, they're talking about, people who are less than, people who deserve to be laughed at or who deserve to be ridiculed. And for those people at that time who had made those choices in their lives, that this is where they stood and that was their truth, I have no qualms with that. That's your decision. But as a child growing up and listening to you and knowing that you share some of that, those tones that are being ridiculed, it really, really does kind of like puts like a veil over the way that you understand society and community. Fortunately, I had other tools in my family that allowed me to understand that I was not necessarily what those people who are singing about what I was feeling felt like. So I was able to navigate through that, but not that many people have had that fortune. And I feel like it's important for me as an artist and as a theater artist to provide those spaces for those other young people or other people to understand that's not the only reality. We make our own truth and we stand in our own truths. You don't have to stand on somebody else's truth and think that that's the way it is. The same happens with the church, with school, with wherever you go. For queer people, it's important that we understand how do we place ourselves and how do we gather strength to move forward and continue contributing to society. So for me, it was really that song stayed with me when I was growing up. But when I got rid of it, when I understood that song had no impact on me, I used it as a tool to come back and say, "Hey, you've been talking about this. Hey, look at my hand now. Look where it is right
Right.
now." So,
Right. So you use the song sort of as a key to unlock the door to this conversation that you ended up having over the course of 10 years with the
yes,
community and with other artists. So one of the things that also seems sort of fascinating to me is the idea that activism played as large a role as providing opportunities to Latin artists. Is that true?
that is so true. I think we once you're placed in a position where you're like in that fighting corner, where you have to find out, okay, who are my allies? What can I do to improve where I am? You become an activist by nature, by force of nature. You have no other choice but to respond and to situate yourself in a position of strength and surround yourself by those individuals that are also seeking that same strength. I was fortunate to be part of that movement in the late 80s and 90s that saw a rebirth of activism in the queer community or re-strengthening that encompassed so many different areas, from being out in the streets marching, from making that presence being heard, from making sure that wherever we were working at, we were coming out openly as queer people and saying, there's someone around you that is like this. So that activism back then was not just a way of surviving, but that's the only way we could live, was just being out there, being active, and providing those opportunities for those conversations to happen. Now it's a little bit different. I think people have, I feel like, today it is your responsibility to educate yourself, not to expect someone else to educate you on what's being oppressed, how they're being oppressed. But it is everyone's responsibility to really take those things, be responsible for that, and say, oh, I am part of a society that keeps growing and changing. But back then, we didn't have so many of those doorways to go through a conversation about representation and affirmation. And so we had to become activists. I was so fortunate to be part of Latino Gay Men of New York back then. Fortunate to be part of Boricua Gay and Lesbian Forum back in the day. To join the board of directors of HoMoVISIONES as another organization and group of individuals that were fighting to have a voice, saying our voices as queer people need to be heard. So activism
Well,
was something that really informed every decision that we made back then and still does.
so, you brought up HoMoVISIONES, and I want to take that as a moment where we can bring Aida into the conversation. Aida, can you tell us a bit about HoMoVISIONES from your perspective and how the archive came into Centro's collection? Um, the This is a multi-part question, and then I'm hoping after you talk about how the archive came into the collection, if you could also talk about the context at the time it was airing and its significance as the first LGBTQ TV show.
Yeah, sure. So HoMoVISIONES is actually one of many moving parts in an archiving initiative led by CUNY and CUNY TV. Other shows that were aired on public access television include Politics con Sabor, the Medgar Evers College Archives, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, and I took part in HoMoVISIONES in the summer of last year as a few hundred tapes were being digitized, and my work primarily concerned accessibility, so captioning, color grading, quality control. And I also want to thank Kelly Hayden, the project manager for this archiving initiative, David Rice, who's the director of archives, and Katrina Schlosser, who's the archivist at CUNY TV. And so basically the Center of Puerto Rican Studies, who have been stewarding this collection, gave this to CUNY TV because they had the facilities as a broadcast archive and the know-how on how to preserve this collection.
So you talked a little bit about the color correction and other technical things. Can you just share with people the condition of the broadcast tapes that you received and what you had to go through to make them, to digitize them and make them accessible to the general public?
Right, so the VHS tapes were mostly in good condition, but tapes have this issue called sticky shed syndrome. They deteriorate over time. And that's basically when, to get really technical, when the binders in magnetic tape, which hold the ferric oxide, the magnetic coating separates from the plastic carrier. And to remedy this, the short-term solution is to basically bake the tapes. So you put them in something that, it's literally a vegetable dehydrator that my supervisor bought from Amazon. So she sticks them in there for long periods of time at a controlled temperature between 130 and 140 degrees. And it lets the tapes, you can play them at least once after this treatment. And that's all you need to be able to digitize a tape, to be able to play it through all the way once. And I think this is a curiosity people might find interesting is, of course, the goal is to digitize them, to make them publicly accessible online. But also a long-term preservation strategy is to put things back on tape again. So we also have everything backed up on LTO tape. And that's a very stable tape. And yeah, so that's basically the process.
Okay. So one of the things that I assume happened, you were probably very young or not yet a twinkle in your parents' eyes at the time. I'm assuming that you learned some things as a result of this process of archiving. And I'm curious about what you figured out in terms of activism, the Latino community's activism in particular during that time, and why you think it's important to share that with viewers today.
Yeah, I mean, it is, marginalized voices have not had a presence in history for a very long time. And it's shocking to realize that maybe only in the last 50 years, 100 years, out of the millennia of human society, have we been diligently recording, preserving, and writing scholarship on these communities. So, I mean, to be a bit academic, there are usually, you can categorize the field of archiving through three primary historiographies. The first is maybe what I would call administrative archiving. So someone who is attached to government, the state, royal archives follow this model. And this is a form of official history. And that's mostly what we know of from history. And then there's modern archiving, where as history became an academic discipline and institutions, we were able to think critically about history and sort of expand it to a broader constituency. And now what I would call the postmodern era of archiving, you are very much an activist. You are serving as a mediator between communities. And in this case, HoMoVISIONES was deposited into institutions, and a lot of this preservation work was done within those institutions. But I also hope this collection can serve as a motivator for communities themselves to carry on this work. And yeah, I mean, that's one of my takeaways.
How would a community, and in this case, we're talking about the LGBTQ community, the Latinx community, how would they go about preparing current materials for future archives?
Right. So there are a lot of community initiatives. I can say in New York specifically, relating to tape specifically, there is an organization called the XFR Collective. And there's a bunch of resources online that you could look at. And they also have the facilities to digitize tape for you for free. So U-matic, VHS, Betacam, whatever you have on hand. And this is just New York City, and I can only speak on New York City, but I'm sure in other cities there are similar community initiatives.
So, okay, that is all really, really fascinating. And I want to bring Jorge back into the discussion so that we can ask him about the activism aspect of this again and how that played into both of your projects. Jorge, so, you know, one of the things that your film does is talk about fighting for representation within the community, both the Boogie Down Bronx community and the queer community. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that in terms of this archiving that Aida just took us through and the current day efforts that people should be considering as we look at as we assess having more tools available to us as individuals to begin creating those archives.
Yes, James. I think one of the best examples and the most plain examples of the importance of documenting ourselves, what's happening around us, happening during the pandemic itself, and even before with George Floyd and people taking out their phones and documenting moments that so often go unnoticed or or not necessarily told in a way that a community can galvanize around it. And I think those tools are now in our hands. They're not just a documentary filmmaker that waiting for a documentary filmmaker or for an academic to come into a community with their tools from whatever they bring to officialize the history of a community. And I think what Aida is saying is so true. It's really about us right now at this moment. That postmodern archival or documentation is one that belongs to each and every one of us. And we do not need the sanctions of institutions or TV stations or anything like that to really see the importance of that. HoMoVISIONES did that. HoMoVISIONES, and I was so fortunate to be part of that board of directors that supported the work of this group of artists, my colleagues and friends at the same time as well, because we were not that many, so we would gather and move in the same circles. So when Gonzalo Aburto and Heriberto and Candido said, Jorge, I know you're doing arts and theater. You got to be on our board. And I was like, of course I'll be on your board, you know. But it was that spirit of us taking charge of the tools that we had access to at that point, and just turning that camera right back into our community and just looking at what's happening and seeing how we were navigating our world at that time and documenting that. And that was so powerful. Now we look 20 years later, the importance of this body of work, it still remains very relevant. I know that I've met younger people that have watched the HoMoVISIONES series and now have become activists, and they come to me or I know to Heriberto as well and saying, you know, when I was 14 years old, I was back, or 12 years old, I would turn my TV on when my parents were not watching, got cable access, and watch HoMoVISIONES and wait for HoMoVISIONES to come up. And that was my connection to the world back then. So it is important that those leaders were not waiting for the mainstream to tell them what to do. They were looking for other ways in which they could see themselves reflected. And I think that's why it's so important that us as artists understand that we do have that responsibility and that role and that power to gather and to invite people into a different way of looking at themselves, and looking at this whole body of HoMoVISIONES and seeing the breadth of experiences and voices that were being generated and were being like created at that time. We were discussing it and forming our opinions of ourselves and trying to figure out what that was. That is such an important moment in us looking at our history as LGBTQIA people. The same with Asunción. Those 10 years, those playwrights that said presente and said, I want to be part of this at Pregones in the South Bronx, and brought works that expanded our notion of gender, of sexuality, of family, of history, of connection, and of love. And those spaces really allowed us to grow as a people and as a community. So and that's why it's so important to show those works right now, to show the HoMoVISIONES body of work and show the Asunción work, so that we understand where we are right now and what else do we need to do moving forward to continue this work.
So Jorge, one of the things that's most interesting is that you recently joined forces with the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater. And so now you present both in Manhattan and in the Bronx. And I'm wondering if you see any distinction between those two boroughs and the reactions that you get to the work that you are presenting, which is representative of the Latinx community in particular.
Yes, we're so proud and honored that we are still the only Latina, only Puerto Rican house in the Broadway district. It's a house that Miriam Colon, who passed on and transitioned, founded in that firehouse built in 1888. And that it still is a historical landmark, and that is still a place where our community says, this is where I choose to go see art. And so when we merged the two companies, we knew that there was a difference, but we also knew that we had an audience and people who choose us, choose what we do and the types of work that we present, no matter where we go, and they will follow us. We have audiences that still love to go to the Bronx, and that's where they go. And they're like, I don't want to go to Manhattan. This is closer to home. I don't need to deal with parking or anything. It's right there, And there's audiences that are experimenting with that, who we are, or also who are following the long history that the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater has. So there wasn't that much of a difference between the audiences that are coming there. I think it's more about what's happening in those neighborhoods around those two venues. I know the South Bronx is right now in the midst of a very aggressive gentrification process that it's really aggressively right now, faster than it happened in Brooklyn and in Long Island and in Queens. It's right now like buildings are coming up and are challenging, are making it a bit more challenging for the history of the Bronx and of those neighborhoods to really be present. And we are strong, and we're so glad that we have our venue. We own it free and clear in the South Bronx, that we have a long-term relationship in the city with our Manhattan venue, and we will continue to be committed to providing access to the arts at affordable prices, not at Broadway prices, the prices that our community can share with their family and say, I want to go see arts of the highest quality there. So it's for us, it's more like carrying on that tradition when we joined with the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater of a medium already fought for so many years, and we are hopefully doing that work.
Miriam was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
So I want to bring Aida back into the conversation here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what she felt, and I'm switching, Jorge, as you as an elder and her as a younger member of the community. I wanted to find out, Aida, what you thought was one of the most profound episodes of HoMoVISIONES that you archived, and why it had such an impact on you.
Let me first re-answer this question you asked. My advice to people who are trying to archive something: you can find technical advice, the Library of Congress, etc. But I think one dogma to live by is dissemination. Like, say something, say it again, post it again, translate it, say it in a different language. And that's basically the methodology with this project. Heriberto was disseminating news in a different language. We took on this show from 2 decades ago and are stating it again. So, but in regards to the most impactful episode, it's probably the first episode, the pilot episode, and it comprises street interviews with people. And it was just, yeah, it was amazing just to hear people standing on the streets speaking about their background. So yeah, I love that informality, and that of course is not the model which every episode follows, but it is one of my favorites.
Perfect. So before we go any further, I thought it'd be great if we shared a clip from HoMoVISIONES, and we'll come back and we'll talk about what we see after the clip plays. Here we go.
Katy Chan de las Buenas Amigas, y esta noche nos hemos reunido aquí para protestar en contra de la estación Mega 97.9. Es una estación en español. Ellos hablan acerca de mucha homofobia, sexismo y racismo, y para mí es gran orgullo que nosotros estemos aquí tratando de parar ese tipo de habla odiosa en contra de nosotras como mujeres, como lesbianas, como latinos, y contra todos los miembros de la comunidad aquí en Nueva York.
¿Quién integra esta coalición que han formado para hacer este trabajo?
Es una coalición histórica, está formada por las Buenas Amigas, las lesbianas vengadoras y las africanas, las lesbianas africanas unidas para cambio social.
Thank you. So, Jorge, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Sure. There might be some people in our audience who are not as fluent or familiar with Spanish. Can you just share what that clip was about? It spoke to what I was hinting at earlier.
Again, every time I see these clips, my what's it saying in English, goosebumps, or my hair?
Yes, goosebumps.
Goosebumps, because it's looking back at that moment in history. In this particular clip, Katy Chan, one of the leaders of Las Buenas Amigas, which was a collective of very fierce sisters, lesbians from all Latin America, mainly Spanish speaking, but not all of them. I mean, And we had Daisy de Jesus as part of that as well. But in this case, Catchy Chain was like talking about a coalition that they made of other women-led organizations of color, lesbian organizations of color, who were protesting Mega, one of the radio stations back then. I believe that was 1990. Heriberto would tell me what year that was, but or late 90s, who were spewing a lot of homophobic stances and jokes, and the women had it, and they said, we're here together in this coalition of our African American sisters, other Latina women organizations saying enough, ya basta, and we're not going to stand it anymore. And that is so typical to for how we lived back then. It was those moments of coming together and saying, we're not going to take it anymore. And HoMoVISIONES captures so much of that moment and so much of that pulse of what was happening. And that was like a daily basis for us back then. So often people think that only ACT UP were the only ones that had that voice of resistance. And so many of us know that that is not the case. Resistance moments for struggles for liberation have accompanied every community that has been oppressed, has had those moments throughout the history of humanity. And it's great that we highlight some, but HoMoVISIONES and Asunción also show other alternatives, that our communities took those moments in our hands and said enough, and this is who we are. And this clip is a beautiful clip of a night in Manhattan of all these women coming together and shouting. And if you watch more of the actual episode, you actually see them shouting at them at this radio station, like enough, enough, we're tired of this. So
great, thank you for that. Aida, so this was a perfect example of what you were talking about. And one of the things that I'm curious about, can you share with people some other examples of those sort of seminal moments in the program that made you certain that you had chosen the right project to archive?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in one of our earlier meetings, and it doesn't relate to the LatinX community, but it is about the St. Patrick's Parade and how the queer community to this day is still forced to have their own segregated parade on a different day. And Heriberto did a report, I think it was you did a report on this phenomena 20 plus years ago. And it was really, it just,
and
continuity.
It's part of the archives, that report that Heriberto did. So I think
and I can probably pull it up.
I think he's still with us. Heriberto, can you talk briefly about what motivated you to do that particular episode or reporting?
Well, you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, that particular story, I wasn't the one who did it. I believe it was Candido, Gamaliel, and Gonzalo. Because I mean, we have a show of a 30-minute show, but and sometimes I was the host, but that didn't mean that I was always like doing the hosting or the reporting. It was like vice versa. But that particular story, I think it was made by Gonzalo or Gamaliel.
And what motivated that for them at the time?
I mean,
was it just frustration? Was it the ya basta?
I think, yeah. I mean, a lot of that. I mean, we can, as Latina, we can all gay Latinx or LGBTQ plus Latina. We can also relate to other groups, their struggle, and it was probably the same struggle that we were having. I remember that, for example, in the Puerto Rican National Parade many years ago, it was the first big parade that allowed gay Latino groups to march, to participate.
Yes, yes.
So for us, at the time, probably, not this other parade, not letting this other group to participate was also important. And that was part of the discussion at the time,
And and
and
I
still
think that
is.
I think that's the beauty of what you were doing. It was universal in its nature, but it was also very specific. It was
Mm,
specific to the Latinx community, but it was universal in its efforts to bring a voice to underrepresented communities, or really communities that were being put down no matter what. I wanted to circle back to Jorge. You brought up something that I think most people are not familiar with or are not clear about, Jorge, and that was the relationship between ACT UP and the Latinx community and the community that you were working in as an artist. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. When we talk when more often when people think about queer activism in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, but particularly 80s and 90s, immediately people go to ACT UP as the voice of queer, uh, uh, the representation of queer activism back then, and uh, and I don't want to take any props away from what ACT UP did. I was a champion of ACT UP, of many, not all, of many of the things that they did. But I always am. I hope that people are aware that, like I said before, that is not a totality of what was going on. I think initiatives like what HoMoVISIONES was doing, what we were doing with what Las Buenas Amigas was doing, Latino Gay Men of New York was doing at that time, Boricua Gay and Lesbian Forum, HOGO, Hispanic United Gays and Lesbians, and even individuals like Gonzalo Aburto, who's one of the founders of HoMoVISIONES, and he's the one that you saw interviewed Kathy, who was at the forefront of he was also part of the Latino caucus of ACT UP, who understood that dynamic of what needed to be addressed. But I think that so often people forget that there are communities out in the on the margins that really embodied activism in an entirely different way than ACT UP. And I think it's important for projects like this, for Asuncion and for Homovisiones, to document that and to share that so people are aware and can celebrate those voices as well. I remember many instances where we were doing all the AIDS prevention and education through theater in our community in the South Bronx, and we were cultivating relationships with you know, churches, priests, very conservative groups within our community who wanted information, who needed information, and then we were cultivating it. And I remember moments where ACT UP would come into our events and try to destroy everything by just being loud and just doing some sort of an action and then going back to Manhattan and forgetting about everything that we were doing. And I was always so adamantly against that kind of intervention. And it happened more than once in which all the work that a lot of our communities were doing were completely erased by the media following this supposed voice. And that's why we always kept a very strong front against those moments and saying to people, no, you're not coming into our communities like that. And it's not because we were being against ACT UP. The contrary, it's telling you, if you want to support our communities of color, this is how you do it. Not the way you want, it's the way that we are determining how we weave those threads.
Well,
Heriberto was talking a little bit about that, about the parades. That's a great example. We have the Irish Parade and the Puerto Rican Parade, activist groups from both those communities working within those organizations that lead those celebrations to make sure that there's a space in there. And that's why those two conversations happen and why Homovisiones went to document that experience of the Irish queers in the Irish Parade. But it was that moment
right.
in history that shared that.
Right. I think that, we touched on a lot of the way media has played a role in queer identity. And you guys have been brilliant in sharing your perspectives. But I wanted to pause here and take some questions from our viewers. I want to remind you that you can use the Q&A function in the webinar here, but I have some questions that have already come in. I'm going to start with the first question, which is to you, Jorge. And it says, Jorge, how difficult has it been to raise funds and obtain grants for Pregones? Has it been difficult to be a Latinx organizer and artist?
We are fighting that battle on a daily basis. We have a commitment to making sure that our communities have a space where they can come and partake of arts, high art, the best quality possible. And that is an uphill battle always, because we always have to educate people as to why our voices are important. But we're doing good. We have been uh, successful in maintaining our space in the South Bronx. We own it free and clear, and we're in the process of renovating our educational wing so we can have more access to that. But it's an ongoing education for both funders and donors, and we keep on inviting people to say presente and to join our family. So, but I think it's when you compare after the long history that we have, and you compare similar organizations that are not people of color, and you go like, wow, there's still a balance that needs to be addressed as to uh, more access to funding. And I think we're constantly becoming advocates for that to take place. But we are still a 501c3 organization, a nonprofit organization. We believe in that model. We think that is the way that our voices in our communities can still be represented. And and it's an ongoing process of educating people about why the arts are important
Yes.
and why is it important to have
Yes.
conversations like this. It never ends. It never ends. You know,
Yes.
always someone else comes and they choose education or the sciences, and we go, the
Right.
arts are essential for the well-being of any society. And so it's just coming back, and we love doing that. That's fine. We continue doing that, but we continue to invite people to join those efforts and to join those moments and those institutions in our community that have been there for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Aida, I'm going to combine two questions from our viewers for you. The first one is, as an archivist, how do you decide which projects you take on? And as an archivist of HoMoVISIONES, what was your greatest difficulty in doing this project?
Well, I want to congratulate Jorge because I saw this in the New York Times, the print edition. This is from Torched. You guys got a big grant from the Wallace Foundation, so congratulations.
Yes, congratulations, Jorge.
Thanks.
Bravo, bravo.
But to answer the question, I am, to be honest, not at the point in my career where I have, where I can be, where I have control over what gets preserved or what doesn't. I see that there's a project that's ongoing and I want to be a part of it. And so that's what happened with HoMoVISIONES. I saw this opportunity. It seemed really interesting to me and I wanted to partake. So cultural heritage is what's very important. As an archivist, there's a diversity of things you can do. You could be a bureaucratic archivist, and that may be important, and that might be important to scholarship in a way I can't really predict. But there's something salient about a document, and I call it a document, a record, because that's what it is, like HoMoVISIONES, and to be able to reflect on it and to make it accessible, widely accessible. It's really satisfying.
Yes. Okay, great. So I have another question here for Jorge. It says, do you think that HoMoVISIONES has a possibility to return? Maybe not to public access necessarily, but perhaps online, perhaps even in person as a summer HoMoVISIONES series?
Well, I think Heriberto might be better to answer that. I can answer about Asuncion, that we are certainly first celebrating this opportunity that the First 20 through All Arts gave us to document this moment in history. We are thinking of bringing it back in a couple of years from now, but at the same time, so pleased that there's so many different platforms right now for queer LGBTQIA plus artists to celebrate their work. I just came from seeing Mara's amazing play, Soho Repertory, who just closed this past Sunday, where two drag queens challenged Promesa, and beautifully done. And it's a drag show challenging a system of oppression in a country, and that was fabulous. And so I see so much of it happening right now. So we love to continue to contribute to those voices, and for HoMoVISIONES, it's really interesting because, and Heriberto, I'm going to ask you to jump in for this because it really was about the group of activists that was together at that time using the tools that they felt more comfortable with. Uh, and I think you can't replicate that unless you have all those people together right there again. Some of them have passed on. Uh, those voices remain with us in our hearts. But it really is something that, Gonzalo, Heriberto, and other folks who want to
Amigo.
re-examine that at Candido to re-examine what would be the next role for HoMoVISIONES. I know our board meetings for HoMoVISIONES were a lot of fun. They were not your typical very strict board meetings. We always had food. We was always at someone's apartment, and we laughed a lot in those board meetings. And so it's really about what do these group of folks want to do if they want to come back together and where they are in their lives. Uh, so I don't know, Heriberto, what do you think of bringing HoMoVISIONES
Well,
back?
I don't know. I don't think that you can replicate a story like the one that we have. Our purpose when we created HoMoVISIONES was to, have HoMoVISIONES there for more than 10 years. That was how HoMoVISIONES lasted. It started in 1994 until 2004. But I don't know. If you want to make the reunion, everybody is making a reunion, right?
Yes, yes.
But if someone is interested in doing a reunion, please let me know, or let us know, a few months ahead, so I can start going back to the gym, lose a few a few pounds.
Oh, wow, that's great. So listen, I'm going to start to wrap us up here, but I have one final question that I wanted to present. And it came in from an anonymous attendee, but someone who's obviously interested in this conversation. It says, Jorge and Heriberto, what do you see as the biggest impact of the program HoMoVISIONES? That'll be our final question before we close out.
Well, for me, as a journalist, I never consider myself an activist. So when I joined HoMoVISIONES, it was always my journalist perspective. Gonzalo, Candido, and the others, and Gamaliel, they were really the activists. They were coming from ACT UP. But the idea of me joining HoMoVISIONES, and I think also the impact that HoMoVISIONES has at the time, was that young people were watching the show. And that when I got the first letter of this kid telling me that he waited until their parents were sleeping to turn on HoMoVISIONES, and he later became one of our interns in the show when he was older. That was what I was looking for. I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't have any positive image of what LGBTQ Latino or any other person was. So I wanted to give that option to a young LGBT kid that wasn't feeling that being gay was okay.
Yes, that's brilliant. And I'm sure that there are many people who are grateful to all of you for having done this and for making it accessible right now. I want to thank you all for sharing.
I think Jorge was going to say something.
Sure, I can just add really quickly. I know we only have a minute left, but I just wanted to add that the impact for me is twofold. One is the impact at the moment that these two projects were happening, which is what was happening with the community and the impact that it had on other young people or other artists in that community, having those conversations in the arts and in media. So that's one thing that it's really, really important and concrete. And the other one is the impact that looking back, that history has right now. What is the impact of history? And history as an active participant in the ongoing struggles for liberation in our society. And looking back at those two moments in history right now, the impact it has for me is for Asuncion is those artists that were there, they're now becoming part of the fabric of the history of our community. The same way that in HoMoVISIONES, those activists that gave life to HoMoVISIONES are now both documented as integral components and contributors to the way that our communities continue to grow. And we have to go look back at those names. We have to come back to our ancestors. So these are the people that paved the way for where we are today. So for me, it's a twofold impact. It's what happened then, but also the impact of looking back. It's really important. Not someone else, us looking back, saying, these are our heroes. These are the ones that said, this is our road, this is our bridge. Let's continue walking together.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Again, I want to wrap it up. I'm going to hand it off to you, Heriberto, to take us out. And I thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, James. Well, hasta aquí llegó esto. I hope everybody understand that. Thank you to all the participants for this great conversation that we had with James, Jorge, Aida. And I want to thank again the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College for coordinating this event. And just for all the people who were watching our conversation, remember that the archive of HoMoVISIONES there is a link, I was told, where you can just click and you will have access to all the material from HoMoVISIONES, and also you will get another link for the documentary that talks about Jorge and the great job that he's doing in Pregones. So, hasta aquí llegó. Goodbye.